Challenger explosion. On a freezing morning in January 1986, Challenger lifted off, and 73 seconds later, it broke apart in the sky. The chain of mistakes that caused the disaster began the night before. NASA's shuttle program relied on rubber seals called O-rings to keep hot gases inside the rocket boosters. Morton Thiokol, the company that built them, knew cold weather could make those seals too stiff to work properly. That morning, Florida's temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 8 degrees Celsius, far below the O-ring's safe limit of 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Thiokol engineers urged NASA to delay the launch and presented data from earlier cold weather flights that showed clear O-ring damage. NASA managers resisted the delay, with Lawrence Malloy asking if they were supposed to wait until April for warmer weather. After Thiokol executives joined the call and held a short private discussion, they overruled their own engineers and approved the launch. 73 seconds after liftoff, the right booster's O-ring failed, releasing superheated gas that tore through the fuel tank. Challenger broke apart at 46,000 feet, killing all 7 crew members, including teacher Krista McAuliffe. The Rogers Commission later found that NASA's culture and decision-making process had ignored clear warnings, making this a tragedy written on the ground before it ever happened in the air. No opinion to Saddam. In the summer of 1990, Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein had 100,000 troops camped just outside Kuwait. The standoff was already dangerous, but a single line from an American diplomat may have tipped it into war. Saddam accused Kuwait of demanding repayment of $14 billion loan from the Iran-Iraq war, overproducing oil and driving down global prices. Frustrated, he summoned the U.S. ambassador April Glaspie for a meeting in Baghdad. Following instructions from Washington, Glaspie avoided threats or escalatory language. She told Saddam that America had no opinion on disputes between Arab states, including Kuwait. She also said she hoped for friendship and warned against violence, but the phrase "no opinion" was all he seemed to hear. To Saddam, it sounded like a green light to act. Just 8 days later, Iraqi forces swept into Kuwait and occupied control in less than 12 hours. The invasion triggered an enormous U.S.-led military response. Operation Desert Storm killed 20,000 Iraqis and set off decades of sanctions and conflict. Some historians still believe that if the ultimatum from the U.S. had been unmistakable, Saddam might have hesitated, and Kuwait's fate could have been very different. Napoleon at Waterloo. On the morning of June 18, 1815, Napoleon's army faced the Duke of Wellington near the small Belgian village of Waterloo. Every hour mattered, because Prussian reinforcements were on the move. Napoleon told Marshal Grouchy to pursue the retreating Prussians after the previous day's battle at Ligny. His instructions were vague, telling him to keep pressure on them and prevent a link-up with Wellington's forces. Grouchy marched east toward the town of Wavre, unaware that the main fight had already started less than 10 miles away. The distant sound of heavy cannon fire reached his officers, who urged him to change direction, but he refused, insisting his orders were clear. By late afternoon, Napoleon launched his final assault on Wellington's position. At that same moment, 50,000 fresh Prussian troops smashed into the French flank, but Grouchy was still miles away, fighting a minor rearguard. As daylight faded, Napoleon's army crumbled under the combined Allied assault, forcing him into abdication and exile. The failure to redirect Grouchy's corps in time had sealed the defeat at Waterloo, and with it, the end of his empire. Battle of Karansebes. While the first 3 events could have been avoided, this one was a plain blunder and almost darkly comedic. In September 1788, the Austrian army camped near the town of Karansebes, expecting to engage the Ottoman Empire. What happened that night was not an enemy attack, but something far stranger. A group of Austrian cavalrymen rode ahead to scout the area, and instead found a camp of Romani traders selling alcohol. After buying the liquor and drinking heavily, the cavalry was confronted hours later by Austrian infantry demanding their share. The refusal sparked an argument that ended with a shot, and in the darkness someone shouted that the Ottomans were attacking. Officers yelled, "Halt!" to restore order, but the Habsburg army included Germans, Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, and Italians who could barely understand each other. Many misheard it as Allah, the Ottoman battle cry, and panic spread through the ranks. Artillery opened fire on their own men, believing the camp was under assault. By dawn, 10,000 Austrian soldiers were dead or wounded. When the real Ottoman army arrived 2 days later, they found the town undefended and claimed victory without firing a shot. Pearl Harbor. The roar of engines grew louder over Pearl Harbor until it merged with the thunder of exploding battleships, drowning the quiet of a Sunday morning on December 7, 1941. In less than 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled, and over 2,400 Americans were dead. In the weeks before the attack, American intelligence had been reading Japanese messages that hinted war was coming. One order instructed embassies to destroy their code machines, a move often taken before declaring war. Analysts figured Japan would hit easier targets targets like British colonies in Southeast Asia rather than risk attacking Hawaii, America's heavily fortified Pacific base. On the morning of the strike, radar operators detected a large formation of aircraft heading toward Oahu. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, believing they were American B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland, dismissed the sighting and no alarm was raised. With ships anchored in tight formation and planes parked wingtip to wingtip, the harbor became an open target. Japanese torpedoes tore through battleships, bombs ignited fuel reserves, and airfields were reduced to burning wreckage. The attack shocked the United States and ended any debate over joining the war. Within hours, America moved to full military mobilization, and the Pacific became the focus of a relentless campaign. Chernobyl. The explosion at Chernobyl's Reactor 4 hurled a 2,000-ton lid into the air, lighting up the night sky over Pripyat. It was the start of the worst nuclear disaster in history, resulting from a multi-layered communication breakdown. In April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine prepared for a safety test to see if its turbines could keep coolant pumps running during a blackout. The test had been delayed and passed to the less experienced night shift, who received only partial instructions from the earlier crew. While reducing power, the operators pushed the reactor too low, creating dangerous instability. Instead of stopping, Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov ordered the test to continue and insisted on bypassing safety systems to stay on schedule. At 1:23 a.m., the shutdown command should have ended the danger, but the flawed design of the control rods triggered a tremendous power surge instead. Two explosions tore the reactor apart, spreading radiation across Europe and forcing the evacuation of entire towns. Cleanup and containment would last decades, the environmental and health costs still echo today, and the total economic damage is now estimated at nearly $900 billion. Berlin Wall falls. A single word from an unprepared spokesman cracked open the Berlin Wall in an epic case of deadly miscommunication that brought the Cold War's most famous barrier crashing down. Günter Schabowski, the public face of East Germany's government, was set to meet the journalists on November 9, 1989. They were supposed to discuss the new travel rules, a measure meant to ease restrictions without completely opening the border. Schabowski had not attended the meeting where the details were set. When asked when the new rules would take effect, he flipped through his papers, found no clear guidance, and replied, "As far as I know, immediately." Broadcast across East Germany, his words sparked a rush of people toward the border crossings. Guards, also hearing the announcement but with no official orders, were pressed by swelling crowds. By late evening, they began letting people through as thousands streamed across checkpoints, climbed over the wall, and celebrated with strangers from the west. By midnight, the barrier that had divided Berlin for 28 years was no longer holding anyone back, symbolizing the end of the Cold War. Battle of Antietam. One misplaced order wrapped around 3 cigars gave the Union Army a perfect chance to crush Confederate General Robert E. Lee, but they squandered it. In September 1862, Lee divided his army while invading Maryland, following detailed orders known as Special Order 191. Confederate soldiers accidentally left a copy at their campsite, where Union soldiers discovered it and rushed it to Commander George McClellan. This gave him intelligence commanders almost never see, including Lee's exact locations and troop movements. McClellan even telegraphed President Lincoln about his discovery. But here's the twist: his habitual caution and overestimated view of Lee's strength delayed his attack by 18 hours, giving Confederate forces time to regroup. When the armies finally met at Antietam Creek on September 17th, fighting raged from sunrise to sunset. Cornfields, bridges, and open fields became killing grounds, leaving 23,000 dead or wounded in the deadliest one-day battle in American history. The battle ended without a decisive victory, but the Union stand gave Lincoln the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, changing the course of the war and American history. World War I Wrong Turn Assassination. A driver's wrong turn on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo began the sequence of events that led to World War I. That day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, toured the city in an open car with his wife Sophie. Earlier that morning, they had survived a failed bombing attempt, and officials changed the return route for safety. But in a terrible comedy of errors, the updated instructions never reached the chauffeur, Leopold Loika. Driving the original route, he turned onto Franz Josef Street, where a young assassin named Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing. Realizing the error, the driver tried to reverse, but the car stalled. Princip seized his unexpected opportunity and shot both the Archduke and his wife Sophie dead. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia which was rejected, prompting a declaration of war supported by Germany. Soon after, a web of alliances exploded as Russia, Germany, France, and Britain followed like dominoes, fueling the furnace of World War I. Petrov and the false alarm. September 26, 1983, an unsung hero who decided to disobey protocol most certainly saved the world from nuclear war. In the early hours of the day, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was monitoring the Soviet Union's early warning system, OKO. The Cold War was tense, and both sides expected that if an attack came, it would be massive. Suddenly, the system reported that 5 U.S. nuclear missiles were inbound. Protocol demanded that Petrov report the alert immediately, which would have led to a full-scale nuclear retaliation. Instead, Petrov hesitated because he knew the satellite system was new and untested, and a real U.S. strike would likely involve hundreds of missiles, not just 5. Trusting his instincts over the machine, he marked the alarm as a false reading. 23 long minutes passed before the radar confirmed there were no incoming missiles. The cause was later traced to sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, which the satellite mistook for launches. Petrov's decision stayed classified for years, but when it became public, many credited him with preventing a nuclear exchange that could have ended life as we know it. 9/11 intel failure. Critical intelligence withheld from the FBI allowed 2 future hijackers to move freely inside the United States. In early 2000, CIA agent Tom Wilshire tracked Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi to a meeting in Malaysia with known al-Qaeda operatives. Both men held U.S. visas, a fact that should have been shared with the FBI. However, CIA rules discourage passing information about foreign nationals to the FBI, even when they were inside the country. When an FBI agent working within the CIA tried to pass information to his own bureau, the memo was blocked. Al-Mihdhar and al-Hazmi entered the U.S. weeks later, living openly in San Diego under their real names, listed in the phone book while attending flight schools. For 20 months, the FBI remained unaware, and when the CIA finally placed them on a watch list in August 2001, al-Mihdhar was still able to return to the U.S. without being stopped. On September 11th, both terrorists boarded American Airlines Flight 77, which was flown into the Pentagon, killing 184 people. Poor intelligence sharing and fractured communication enabled the most destructive attack on U.S. soil, which could have been avoided. Korean War. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson delivered a routine foreign policy speech to the National Press Club on January 12, 1950, but his careless choice of words would spark a war that has never officially ended. Seeking to calm allies after China's communist revolution, he described a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians to Japan and the Philippines, while deliberately omitting South Korea. Acheson assumed U.S. commitment was understood, but leaders in Pyongyang and Moscow read the omission as a sign that Washington would not intervene if the South was attacked. Stalin, initially cautious about direct confrontation, began supplying Kim Il-sung with tanks, artillery, and aircraft for an assault. On June 25, 1950, North Korean tanks rolled south across the 38th parallel, catching Seoul and Washington off guard. The United States and its allies responded days later, pushing back the invasion but becoming locked in a brutal 3-year conflict. By the time a 1953 ceasefire halted the war, 2.5 million people were dead, including 36,000 Americans, and no formal peace treaty was in place. More than 70 years later, the Korean peninsula remains divided and technically still at war. Fall of Aztec Empire. When Spanish ships appeared off the Mexican coast in February 1519, they seemed like monstrous sea beasts to the Aztec scouts. Ancient prophecies spoke of Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent god who had been banished centuries earlier, but would return as a pale-skinned, bearded figure from the east in the year 1 Reed. But this was no deity, for the man who stepped onto the sand was Hernán Cortés, a ruthless conquistador leading 500 men armed with cannon and carrying the silent killer of smallpox. Against him stood the mighty Aztec Empire, ruled from the jewel of Tenochtitlan by Emperor Moctezuma, which should have crushed his small expedition without breaking a sweat. However, superstition turned this into a fatal miscommunication as the Aztecs sought to honor what they believed was a divine visitor. Gold and sacred feathers sent by Moctezuma were read as a gesture of weakness by Cortés. In just weeks, he entered the capital, took the emperor hostage, and forged alliances with the empire's enemies, ultimately destroying it over the next 2 years. Even more devastating, in 1520 alone, the first wave of smallpox brought by the Europeans killed between 5 and 8 million people. Battle of Salamis. In September 480 BC, the narrow waters of the Salamis Strait became the stage for one of the largest naval battles of the ancient world. The Persian king Xerxes, fresh from burning Athens, went up against a smaller Greek fleet. The Persians had roughly twice as many ships, yet the cramped strait favored the lighter, faster Greek triremes. Themistocles, the Athenian commander, devised a cunning trap. He sent Sisinus disguised as a traitor to tell Xerxes that the Greeks were panicking and planning to escape. Persuaded by this lie and ignoring the pleas of his admirals, Xerxes ordered his fleet into the strait to block both ends. Persian ships, crammed into tight waters, were confronted with a nightmare as they lost formation and couldn't maneuver effectively. Greek vessels attacked in unison, ramming and sinking about 300 ships. The victory at Salamis turned the tide of the Greco-Persian Wars and helped secure the survival of the independent Greek city-states. NORAD false alarm. November 9th, 1979. Alarms erupted inside NORAD headquarters in Colorado as radar screens lit up with a doomsday signal. More than 2,000 Soviet missiles streaking toward the United States in what appeared to be an overwhelming preemptive strike. For decades, this was the moment U.S. military planners had feared. In the command center, officers scrambled to confirm the attack. Protocol called for Strategic Air Command bombers to be launched and nuclear missiles prepared for retaliation. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was notified in the middle of the night, just one step away from waking President Jimmy Carter to authorize a response. The truth was far less dramatic, yet far more chilling. A lieutenant colonel had been given access to the wrong computer and accidentally loaded a training simulation into the live missile alert system. The machine could not distinguish between the war game and reality, sending the entire defense network into a wartime footing. For 6 tense minutes, the United States was on the edge of nuclear war before secondary verification systems reported no unusual seismic activity or missile launches. The incident, now remembered as one of the closest calls of the Cold War, underscored the lethal potential of mixing fallible humans with automated systems designed for instant apocalypse.